Professor Rogoff, it's a pleasure to have you here to talk about your book, Our Dollar, Your Problem. And it's a book, if you allow me to say, it's a book that is not just about economics. It's a book that reads like a memoir book, almost like a memoir book, in which you mention a lot of personal anecdotes throughout the whole book. And for example, very early on in the book, you start talking about your career as a chess player. Can you tell us a little bit more about your upbringing in general?
Well, let me start by saying I wouldn't quite say it's a memoir because there's not that much as a ratio of things. I do use a lot of anecdotes in the book about chess, but also meetings with world leaders, policymakers, but just sprinkled where it's important to motivate something. There are a couple reasons I did that. I think one reason is, particularly as someone who's a professor who writes, I'm very cognizant that AI is coming, and I wanted to write a book that AI could not write. And with no offense to the many fine journalists in the room, I wanted to write a book that a journalist wouldn't be able to write also. And so I was trying to think of how to craft it. And so that idea, I think it's a little unusual how I've written it. Yeah, I did nothing but play chess in the latter years of high school. I actually spent a lot of time here in Spain. The three places I lived in Europe really were England, Spain, and Yugoslavia. And I played everywhere in Spain, in Madrid, Barcelona, Palma de Mallorca, Malaga, Orense, Olat, and I could go on a little bit. You had very, very good tournaments here. I think I learned a lot about life, living that way. But, I mean, obviously, chess plays a role in who I became as an economist as well.
And but at some point, I mean, because you became a professional chess player, but at some point you decided to quit your professional chess career and go to college and become an economist. How was that transition?
Well, it was an unusual thing to do. I was earning more money as a chess player than I did as an economist until my mid-30s. And that is partly says that if you're an academic economist, you earn very little money. But it wasn't an issue about money that stopped. I had a few diverse things. I felt I wanted to do something more important with my life. And I think chess is very important. That's what I thought as a teenager. I didn't like to travel so much. So now I'm an international economist. I travel everywhere. And also, I guess I didn't like my social life as a chess player. I'm told it's much better these days, but I don't know.
Was it in college that you decided to become an economist, or that came later?
No, I sort of fell into economics. I actually intended I had two fields that interested me, the environment, but I was doing a major really in Russian studies because I had learned Russian to play chess. And I don't know, I didn't know anything. And I struggled making the transition to college because I didn't know how to write. I hadn't read anything. It was not easy, and that's an area I felt comfortable. I continued to play full-time in the summers. I didn't give it up completely, and I continued improving. And in fact, when I went to MIT, I dropped out after half a year. I had qualified to represent the United States in the World Championship, which I'd never expected to do, and I wasn't going to not do it. But I realized at that point, I did pretty well, but not as well as I hoped, better than people thought I would. But I realized at that point, I had to pick one or the other. And I could have gone either way, but I did economics.
Mm-hmm. And then you went to MIT for your PhD?
Yeah, no, that's at MIT. That's from MIT, yeah.
And you mentioned in the book a couple of times how influential it was, some of the people that you met at MIT. Would you like to tell us something about that?
So I first have to say one of my couple top advisors and close friend for years. Stanley Fischer just passed away a week ago. And he was a great man. He was number 2 at the International Monetary Fund. He was vice chair of the Federal Reserve. He was a great scholar. He was on my committee. My main advisor was Rudy Dornbush, who may have come, he must have come here. He is this larger-than-life person, incredibly creative, incredibly influential. I still hadn't really become an economist when I was in graduate school. I was still thinking about chess too much, and I hadn't separated. In fact, when Stanley Fischer was looking at my thesis that I wanted him to sign, and he said, "Ken, do you really want me to sign this? It's not very good." And I said, "Yes." This is literally what he said. I said, "Yeah, I want to leave." And it really took me a while. I would say maybe 6 or 7 years from when I went to from the day I entered graduate school to where I really felt like I was an economist.
And did you know that you wanted to specialize on global finance back then, or that came later too?
Well, that was Rudy Dornbush's influence. There were so many people that he was passionate about it. He had exciting ideas. He was interesting. So I fell into it. But then I found a couple ideas that really interested me later.
So we usually have a lot of people in the audience that are graduate students or thinking about becoming graduate students or even to go into academia. Do you have any recommendation about what makes a good academic nowadays? What would be a piece of advice for them?
Well, you're a lot younger than me, so I think you could probably say better.
But you're a lot more influential than I am.
Better than I could. Well, I think you have to be passionate about it. There's just no point doing it if you're not passionate. But I think you have to understand, I think this is true of anything, being passionate about it doesn't mean being every minute, everything you do is just thrilling. I think anyone who loves their job, and I'm sure there are many people here who do, knows that's not how it works. It's more like, do you get highs from it or times that are exciting? And I think that, with chess, that was no problem. I was very passionate about it. I think with economics, it was really only after my first couple of papers, and I'd say really the paper that really changed my life was maybe first the paper I did on exchange rates, but really later I wrote I think the first paper on why you should have an independent central bank. When I wrote that paper, almost no one had an independent central bank. Maybe the Bundesbank, maybe the Fed, and the rest of the world didn't. And I had gone to work at the Federal Reserve as a junior economist and watched what was going on and got this idea. It's a mathematical, it's a game theory model. It definitely uses my chess a little bit, but got this idea. And I just, felt very strong I wasn't going to give up. I had a very hard time getting it published, believe it or not. I was rejected at all the top journals originally. Robert Barrow is a famous economist who written in the area, say, this is silly. The government, the government can just, it's a veil, it's a facade. If you're not doing what the government wants, they'll just take it away. And I think I benefited by being in this real world environment where very few of my other graduate students from MIT were, and just watching and getting a sense of the frictions, how, it wasn't so easy to instantly take away the independence. So that was, I think, very transitional for me. It's become my most famous paper. I think there's some wise person once said to me that the object in academics is to write something that everyone thinks is wrong and will say that it's wrong. And then later they think you're right. Because if everyone right away says your paper's great, it sort of sounds like everyone's been thinking it already. And so anyway.
So that was before you arrived into Harvard, that paper?
Oh, long before I arrived to Harvard.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I've been at so many places. It's embarrassing. But yes, my first job was as an economist at the Federal Reserve. I was a junior economist for the Federal Reserve.
But then at some point, you arrived into Harvard, and that's where you're based right now?
Yeah, eventually I arrived in Harvard 26 years ago, yeah.
And naturally, given the circumstances, one might wonder how are you and your colleagues being affected by all the problems with the administration that are currently, with the Trump administration that are currently going on?
Well, it's an extremely difficult situation. I don't know what will take place. I mean, it changes by the day. It's really hard to predict anything in Trump world. I think there are some very fundamental problems in all the top universities, and I'd particularly point to lack of diversity of thought. It's really incredible. I think it's applied to the American Economic Association, the Economist Economic Association also. So one topic I pick up in the book, it's one of the major motivations for writing the book, is I had been doing research on interest rates, historical research on interest rates, making what you would think is a not very controversial argument that if they're really high, they'll probably come down, and if they're really low, they'll probably come up. We call that reversion to mean, going back to normal. But for a long time, that was considered sacrilegious to say that. Interest rates were very low. Larry Summers, I don't know if you've ever spoken here, he introduced this idea, a few of you may have heard, called secular stagnation. We were going to be in decline. Interest rates were going to be low forever. Paul Krugman said interest rates would always be low. He wrote it again and again and again. The president of the American Economic Association some years ago, Olivier Blanchard, said, debt is free. Interest rates are zero. They're never coming back. I debated all of them over the years. And it was very lonely because everyone was convinced they would never rise again, never have inflation, real interest rates would never be high. And there are many things that motivated me to write the book. But that was certainly one where, I thought this was just nuts. And why would you want to bet everything on that? And so here we are.
And if you don't mind, I would like to ask you a little bit about your experience at the IMF. You were there two and a half years, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. What exactly do you do as the chief economist of the IMF? Is it a research position, or there is a lot of politics also involved in that position?
It depends on what you want to do. So I think I was there at a very interesting time. So Argentina defaulted after I came. Brazil was in trouble. Turkey almost defaulted. There were a whole bunch of, the Russian default had just happened. I came after the Asian crisis. And so it was, from a policy point of view, it was very, very interesting time. I mean, it's almost always a very interesting time, but I think that was unusual. I learned a lot. You're an economist and you know models. I think I'd already, when I arrived, written this book with Maury Obstfeld called The Foundations of International Economics that I apologize to any of you that have used it as a text. It's very difficult. But it was sort of the standard graduate text. And I wouldn't say that I thought I knew everything, but I didn't realize how little I knew, which I did. And I hadn't, I'd had exposure to policymakers, but really just central bankers. I was a rock star in central banks because I'd written the first paper on central bank independence, and they think central bank independence is great. But central bankers, no offense, it's not really like being a politician or in the Treasury Secretary. And I became exposed to these people under incredible pressure all the time. And you're talking about the problems they face. I give this, I try not to take too long to say it, but this episode that happened to me in the book where the Prime Minister of Lebanon came to the IMF. This was 2002, I think, that it happened. His name was Harari, and he, absolutely a great man, and had unified Lebanon. But Lebanon was in a lot of trouble because basically the revolutionaries were causing trouble already. And Lebanon had a fixed exchange rate, which I think anyone who sort of studied international economics knows it's very hard to do. They had a fixed exchange rate. And to make a long story short, I had a conversation with him. I was asked to about why maybe this was risky. And, he said, well, yeah, but we're going to do it. And the next morning, the finance minister said he wanted to meet with me. And we each have an aide with us, but we're meeting in this room. I don't even think it had any windows. And he said, yes, he was there. He listened at the meeting. We completely understand what you're saying about having a fixed exchange rate. The Lebanese dinar was fixed to the dollar. And he said, you do understand there's a lot of heavy money in Lebanon that would not be very happy if we got rid of our fixed exchange rate. If I were to announce that I'm getting rid of our fixed exchange rate, I would be found floating face down in the Beirut River the next day. He said that to me. And that's an extreme, but many things like that where you realize, you live in some ivory tower and you can show them the model, but it's not the same thing.
So this is a good transition to start talking a little bit more about the economic content of the book. So the book revolves around the idea of the dominant currency, for which it's important to understand what an exchange rate is. Could you tell us why is it important, the concept of exchange rate, and how it relates to the dominance of the dollar?
So I think everyone here is familiar that you used to have the peseta and now have the euro, and that's been very important because now Spain doesn't have its own monetary policy. It's part of the euro. And I think people know what the exchange rate is, but it's very important as an anchor for monetary policy. If you literally adopt the dollar, some countries do, you don't have a monetary policy. You can't set your interest rate. If you peg your exchange rate, you give a fixed exchange rate to the dollar, you also have very, very little control. So that actually was the system after World War II. The dollar was put at the center, and the European countries had to fix their exchange rate to the dollar. Now, some of them went in and out of this arrangement. Some of them changed the exchange rate a little bit. But by and large, it was called the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rate. It worked pretty well. Europe grew. Japan was in the system. Now, to be clear, the dollar was on top, but not of the whole world. China wasn't in it. Russia wasn't in it. Latin America wasn't in it. Most of Asia wasn't in it. Then the system blew up in 1971 because the U.S., although we didn't have to peg our exchange rate, we did have to offer to give people gold for dollars. Not people, or not citizens, but governments. If Spain had a lot of treasury bills and they didn't want them, they could take them to the Federal Reserve and they had to be given gold at a fixed rate, $35 an ounce. And that anchored the system. So in a sense, the world never really left the gold standard for a long time. But in 1971, Richard Nixon was president, and he decided to stop this. There were a number of reasons. We needn't get into it. It probably wasn't tenable. I should say Nixon, to me, is the president closest, the president who's closest to Donald Trump. Okay, I don't want to insult Nixon, but he was also, we have the phrase SOB. You can hear it in the Watergate tapes, which recorded all his everything he said. And he decided that he needed to have more inflation. And if you're having inflation, it's hard to, and the prices of all goods are going up, and you're continuing to trade dollars for gold at a fixed rate of $35 an ounce, it becomes untenable. So he decided to go off of it. And he sent his Treasury Secretary, John R. Connolly, who's this very colorful Texas person from Texas, who had been in the car in Texas when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And he was badly injured but recovered. He was a tough guy too. And he went to Rome, and the Europeans and finance ministers from around the world were saying, what are we supposed to do? You're inflating. We can't give our dollars for gold. What are we supposed to do? And Connolly said, well, it's our dollar. It's your problem. And he, of course, inflated away massively these dollars Europeans were holding. Europeans were holding amounts of dollars similar to the Asian central banks today, which hold trillions of dollars. It's a big amount of money. What I like about the title is, I think, in living as a chess player and sort of getting to really know people around the world, I learned that people love us, but they hate us. And if you want to have a good relationship and you need to look at both sides of that. I tell some stories about it. And I also like, so I don't like that arrogance, but I also think it's ironic. When we got rid of the gold standard, we didn't have a plan for how to do monetary policy. The idea of inflation targeting an independent central bank came later. We had massive inflation in the 1970s. It was our problem. When I finished the book, I did not know who would win the election. I had really basically finished it before Election Day. I don't know if I would have wanted to change the title to "Our Donald, Your Problem" had I continued. But it definitely is very similar, flavor to what's going on now.
Mm-hmm. And so in the book you also mention, so obviously the dollar is the dominant currency in the world right now, but you mentioned several episodes throughout the last few decades in which some other economies were in the way to actually compete with the dollar. Could you tell us something about that?
So I spent quite a bit of time about the rise of the dollar, of how it's not just dominant, it's towering. So, for example, I mentioned it was really just Europe, and we lost Europe. Europe's on the euro. But what happened was China became part of the global system. Russia, for a while, became part of the global system. India, Latin America, all these countries integrated, and the dollar just colonized every place. And so the dollar went to places that the British pound and other, dominant currencies hadn't, had this kind of scope. But I think Americans just treat this as, well, we're the best. So that's what happened. And I think there was a lot of luck involved to get so high. So I talk about Russia. I have my wife here who's worked, she did Sesame Street in Russia and knows a great deal about it. I hadn't been in Russia actually until I visited Natasha producing, she's American by the way, but producing Sesame Street. But I'd lived in Yugoslavia and had some feel of how this system works. It was very dark in parts of Yugoslavia, I'll say. But American economists thought Russia was going to catch up. I'm at Yale. That's what my textbooks say. Samuelson, the great economist of the 20th century. That was the consensus. That was the consensus at the White House, that they would catch up. And I think everyone says now that's impossible. It would never happen. I think they made some mistakes along the way not to be more like China. There were moments, I get into it in the book, where they could have been more like China. And for better or for worse, had a lot more impact in the world. Japan really blew it. Japan, their stock market in late 1980s was worth more than the US stock market. Their housing, their real estate, Japanese real estate was worth more than all US real estate put together. And they were bullied by the United States in this famous Plaza Accord in 1985 into making their exchange rate much higher. And it was a huge mistake. I think if Japan hadn't done that and had just more slowly unfolded, they would be 25 or 30% richer today and much more important country. They were the richest country after the United States, maybe ahead of the United States, but after the United States. Richer than Germany, richer than any other large country. Now they're at the bottom of that group. And it's, yeah, there's demographics, there's China, but I think that the root of it is at this. And I talk about that quite a bit in the book, in part because I had a little role in it, but also because I changed my mind. I spent time in the book talking about speaking to the Chinese leaders, and I thought they should change to a more flexible exchange rate. And they said, no, we will never let happen to us what the Japanese did, never. And come on, the Plaza Accord was in 1985. Japan didn't have their financial crisis, by my count, till 1992. You're telling me one thing led to the other. There were lots of things. And I think as I rethought things over the years, I realized that it takes time to go from the euphoria of the bubble to where you have the financial crisis. People in Spain know this very well. And I wasn't really, thinking about it right, and that I think that was a terrible mistake by Japan. Europe is another example where, okay, things weren't perfect, but I think if you hadn't admitted Greece into the euro, there would have been a much faster solution to the European debt crisis. I talk in the book about how I met with Angela Merkel at the height of the European debt crisis, and my advice to her, and I was saying this in public too, was you should write down some of the debt. Or give the periphery countries, all of them, Spain, Ireland, not Italy, but the smaller ones, you should just, give them whatever they need. It's the cheapest money you'll ever pay. And, she said, first of all, she thought she couldn't, but she particularly pointed to Greece. She says, I can't. We don't trust Greece. It just can't. She even said to me, Portugal, we trust. Spain, we trust. Greece, we don't trust. And so we can't. And I think if it hadn't done that, that recovery would have been quicker. The euro would be a more important currency. It's important today. It's very important, but it would be even more important. And I won't keep droning on, but I go to talk about the mistakes I think China made, which I've done a lot of professional academic papers about.
So continuing with Europe, it has been 15 years since the debt crisis in 2008. What would be your advice if we had a similar crisis as of today? It would be so. Is the monetary union working now better? Because now we have Greece, seems to be working better than it was before. Would your advice be different now?
Well, I mean, the fact 15 years have passed and you got through the crisis, it's all significant, you're married, and so getting divorced is a different question about should you get married. And so I think there's quite a bit of commitment in Europe to keep together the euro. This is, I think, a very important moment for the euro with what Trump's doing. I've argued for a long time to have closer fiscal union in Europe. I don't know if it'll ever happen. But the events that are going on now, where Europe's being forced to spend much more on the military, is going to force a lot of decision-making about how will it be paid for, how will we really have a European military and not just an Italian tank, a French tank, a German tank, the current system. I actually think that the euro is going to do well in the coming years if that proceeds, because being a geopolitical power is actually a very important part of being important in the currency world. I wouldn't say to taking over from the dollar, but to taking a bigger share. And I think that's something very few people seem to understand. And again, I don't want to pick on Paul Krugman, except that I do. He will endlessly write, it's irrelevant, it's absolutely unimportant, it's just nonsense. The US makes the rules of the game. And Donald Trump is very transparent about it. If you don't use the dollar, I'm not going to protect you. If you don't do what I want, I'm going to take away defense. Listen to the Watergate tapes of Nixon back in the 1970s. He's saying things just like that. I don't know what Lyndon Johnson, he was the president in the 1960s, and he was also an SOB as well. And, I guarantee you, behind the scenes, they were very tough. Ronald Reagan had this person, James Baker, who was a real macho Texan person who negotiated that way. I tell about meeting him and, some of the things he did. And so, the fact, it's not just that we're a big economy, it's a big economy and we have the bomb and we have the military and you don't. So, yeah, we think we'll have all the financial system go through the United States. No, we won't have the center in Europe. We don't think so. And so the whole financial system just goes through the United States. It's incredible. And obviously the Chinese hate it. Now what I'm talking about is not the big banks, the clearing system. When trades are making, at the end of the day, somebody's keeping score of, your account went here, your account went there. If it's in dollars, it's mostly going through the United States. And the Chinese hate it, obviously, because they want to take over Taiwan and they don't want sanctions. But many Europeans hate it. It gives us a huge weapon in negotiations where you can't resist because it happened a little over 10 years ago with Iran, where the United States wanted to do one thing, Europe wanted to do another thing, and we basically said, well, okay, but you can't use our banking system, and Europe had nothing. So I think that's one of the reasons. I argue in the book the dollar peaked a decade ago, but it's one of the reasons that everyone was moving away, not rapidly, but moving away from the system somewhat before Trump, wanting to have a more diverse system. It's always more efficient to have one currency. We should just have one currency in the world. There's very good reasons we don't have that. I don't need to explain that to people in Europe, what it would be if we had a world currency. And it's similar with having one reserve currency at the moment. So they're very powerful forces that were causing some frictions, even if the United States wasn't inflicting a lot of self-harm.
So I would like to go more into the problems for the US of being the dominant currency. But before we go into that, another challenger that you mentioned of the dollar dominance in the book is China. And I think it's a very interesting part of the book. You actually spend quite a lot of time talking about China. And one of the things that caught my attention is that you seem to have a positive view of many bureaucrats and many politicians in China about their economic knowledge, at least. And you mentioned, for example, Zhu Rongji in one of the passages of the book. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, so the Chinese officials were chosen much more in a tournament fashion until recently. I think many of you know this. Did you perform well? If you performed well, you get promoted. It was not so much on loyalty. That's much, much less true today, but that's how it's been. And I've met, scores of senators and people, leaders and such. And the Chinese are consistently very impressive. You meet the mayor of any large city, they're impressive through the system. And I think the most impressive one I've met was Zhu Rongji. He was really the architect of modern China. He was Jiang Zemin's prime minister, the number 2 position, but he was in charge of the economy. And, I had first of all, I got to meet him. I was chief economist at the IMF, but I mean, that's nothing, like the number 3, at best the number 3 or 4 official. You don't get to meet Zhu Rongji. But he had seen my debate with Joe Stiglitz at the World Bank, where I took issue with some, in a rather caustic way, with some of Stiglitz's policy advice to emerging markets. I also didn't like that he called Stan Fisher dishonest and called the young economist at the IMF third rate. But it was I gave a very sarcastic, caustic review of his book. And Zhu Rongji had seen it. I met many people that way, had seen it. And he didn't like that Stiglitz wanted less capitalism, more socialism, and he was trying to push in the other direction. So yeah, I got to meet him, and I learned so much from that conversation. I remember at the end of it, I sort of said, well, what keeps you up at night? And he was sort of shocked I would ask that question, because I guess it's too raw to ask a leader like him. But then he thought and said, social stability. If we don't keep growing, we're not going to have social stability, and then I don't know what will happen. And that's very clear now. But I think that was helpful for me about thinking about China.
So going back to the dollar dominance, basically after reviewing some of the other economies of the world that at some point they were potential challengers, you conclude that we have the dollar as the dominant currency for a long, long time. But this is not going to be easy for the U.S. either, because the dominance is not going to be as absolute as it was in the past.
Right.
So can you tell us about the struggles that the U.S. is going to face?
Well, I mean, of course. So what are the advantages of being the United States, aside from it sounds cool to be the reserve currency? We pay lower interest rates. There's no question. We pay lower interest rates. The estimates range from 0.5% to 1%. I'd say they're more towards 1% less. Germany pays lower interest rates than the United States, but it borrows much less. So when I say 1% less than we would be paying, given how much we're borrowing. And this applies to everyone: mortgages, car loans, student loans, everything. So that's very clear. It gives us, in a crisis, we seem to be able to borrow twice as much as everybody else. The progressives say it's never enough. Whatever we borrow, it's austerity, it's not enough. But I point out in the book there are trade-offs between, you want to be able to borrow a lot, that's good. If you have a need to remilitarize, borrow. If you have a financial crisis, borrow. But it doesn't mean it's free, which I think has been a view in economics for a long time. Maybe because it's so dominated by the United States, and universities in some way. Many foreign researchers, but a lot of people are in the United States. And next time could be different. Next time, the bond market may rise faster when we try to borrow a lot, but it's been very helpful. There are also sanctions. We impose financial sanctions. That's what the Europeans didn't like on Iran. We've been doing that instead of invading countries now for quite some time. When I was playing chess and thinking about coming back, I despised Nixon. I don't know, I'm telling you what I thought when I was 17. I have a more nuanced view now, but yeah, I didn't like him. And when I saw he got elected, I didn't want to go back to the United States. I felt just the way young people feel about Trump, I felt about Nixon. And, part of it was we were at war in Vietnam. I had many friends who went to Vietnam. I don't have any close friend who died, but I have a number of close friends who became heroin addicts, and their lives were over. I mean, their lives were ruined. We have sanctions now. That's fantastic. We use it as our spy network. We see all these things going on. There was I don't mention this in the book, but there was, I want to say, a G5 central banker once came to my office in Harvard, just as not long after Trump had been elected, and he was a big expert in the global financial network, and he said he just bought something for his wife using Visa or MasterCard, even though it was in Europe. And he said Trump could see it if he wanted to, because it had to clear ultimately through a U.S. clearinghouse. And that drove him crazy. He wanted to be able to stop that. So, there are all these things. And if we become less dominant, the interest rate will go up. But also, there'll be other ways to do transactions. I mentioned Visa and MasterCard. If there was just American Express, they know everything. But if you can use Visa, MasterCard, other things, Suddenly, there are other ways you can do business. If you think American Express is misbehaving, you can do things other ways. And it's going to be a dramatic change for the United States.
So I would like to go back to one of the things that you mentioned at the beginning of our talk. You talked about how when you were first studying economics, the independence of central banks was not an issue back then. You have a chapter in the book in which you talk about the independence of central banks and how it's important. Why is it important to have an independent central bank?
Well, things go, you can't necessarily speak in any given year, but as a rule, politicians always want lower interest rates. Jean-Claude Trichet once said to me, 99 out of, he was head of the European Central Bank, 99 out of 100 times they want you to lower the interest rate. Donald Trump's screaming that now. I mean, politicians are more careful, but they basically want lower interest rates. And the trouble is that the central bank only sets the very short-term interest rate, overnight interest rate. They don't set the 10-year interest rate, which is actually any loan you get as a business, anything you get as a person, it's the 10-year rate that matters. Well, the central bank can muscle with sheer force set the short-term rate, but it can't set the 10-year rate. It depends on what people, do they expect inflation? What do they expect is going to happen? And so, it turns out that if you let the politicians have too much say, you end up, they always want to push down the rate you set, but it is a danger that it pushes up the longer-term rates. So I mean, having central bank independence has been how we control inflation. If you brought central banks back into the treasuries, we would have high inflation again. You say, no, it will never happen. People don't like inflation. Believe me, we have a long history of this. Before elections, they want to stimulate the economy. The inflation comes later. They'll do whatever it takes. I predict in the book that we're going to get a burst of inflation in the next 4 to 5 years. And remember, I didn't know Donald Trump would win, but I thought whoever was president, because I believe interest rates are higher for a very long time. Our debt is out of control for a very long time. And eventually, this is going to come to a head, maybe around a shock. It's not maybe just going to happen out of the blue, but typically crises happen when you're in a difficult situation and there's a shock. And this is but if the central bank remains independent, you won't get inflation. You'll get very high interest rates, but you won't get inflation. But that's not going to be popular with people. It's not going to be popular with politicians. You'll get recession.
So we're nearing the end of our talk, but I still have 2 questions, if we can fit them in. I would like to ask you about 2 topics that are also in the book, and that pretty much everybody that comes to the foundation lately, they mention them one way or another. One of them is cryptocurrencies, which you mentioned as another challenger to as a possibility for global money. What are the risks of cryptocurrencies, and how should they be regulated, in your opinion? And then I'll ask you about artificial intelligence.
Sure. So there are a remarkable number of people who say cryptocurrency should be worth 0. And there are a remarkable number of people who think it should go to infinity. I take issue with both of them in the book. So the ones who think it should be worthless, they will say it should be used for nothing. Warren Buffett, Jamie Dimon, Nouriel Roubini are among the many, many people who said this. And I think, the thing is, cryptocurrencies are used in transactions in the underground economy. I have papers on this. Many other people do. We see the evidence of it. The underground economy, again, I think speaking in Spain, I don't really need to explain this to you. I mean, it's very big. So my estimate for the world is 20%. I actually have a paper which has estimates for Spain of 25%.
25.
And I mean, I don't believe your unemployment rate's really 11%, et cetera. And the paper currency's been very dominant, but cryptocurrency's making inroads, so that it has value. I think if you do the world, it's a $25 trillion economy. I will just say, I don't know if there's time, but I still have to say parenthetically, some of this comes from having been a chess player, because I see some of these people, particularly academics, who say it's worthless, it's not used for anything. And I had a more bohemian life as a chess player. And I said, they haven't lived life. They just have not seen anything. And it's needless to say. Artificial intelligence, it's interesting. I just had this brilliant young man come to my office to do a podcast at my Harvard office. It hasn't appeared yet. An incredibly brilliant young man. And he starts out by saying, I don't see why you're worried about debt. Artificial general intelligence is around the corner. We're going to be growing. Everybody's growing at 10 or 15% a year. There's never going to be any problems. And I said, it's so refreshing to have you at my office, because everyone else who comes here says the polar ice caps are melting and growth, we'll never have growth again. But I think I do believe in artificial intelligence possibilities, but I don't know what's going to happen. And I followed this my whole life through chess, where, it's been amazing. I talk about this in the book. But how do we get there? The social dislocations, if we really didn't have any regulation, the unemployment that would happen. And I heard Henry Kissinger speak about the military uses of artificial intelligence is really scary. So, I think it's the big problem of maybe not even the next generation, the current generation, of trying to figure out how to deal with it.
And I have a follow-up question regarding the cryptocurrencies. Because one of the reasons why we have central banks is that somebody controls money supply, right? So with cryptocurrencies, that's not happening. There may be people controlling the amount of money in one cryptocurrency, but not the overall amount. So shouldn't we need a similar regulation to a global central bank?
So I forgot to give the other half of the people who think it's infinite. There's a beautiful chapters in Yuval Noah Harari's book *Sapiens*, which many of you may have seen. Beautiful, where he says money is whatever people want it to be, and if people agree that this is money, and what I would call the tech bros in Silicon Valley love this. It means Bitcoin's money. If we just think it's money, it's really money. It's not. They're wrong. The government has tremendous power over what's money. The government can choose what you pay your taxes in. It can choose banking regulation. It can choose how it pays its suppliers. It can make other monies illegal. That's been done over the years. What I've always believed was the only common sense solution was to regulate cryptocurrencies. And I could get into the weeds here, but it's really the banks around cryptocurrencies that you can regulate. You can't really regulate Bitcoin, but you can regulate 98% of all transactions are done at exchanges, which are really banks, and you can regulate that. That's what I thought anyway, till Donald Trump came along. And he said, we're not going to regulate anything, that's why Bitcoin's gone so high. And I don't know if you follow the corruption going on around this. I won't, he's now become a big Bitcoin owner, and he's the regulator, just surreal. Mm-hmm. But eventually it has to get regulated. We're going to have a giant crisis in the crypto, not in Bitcoin itself, but in the infrastructure around Bitcoins. They're banks. If you don't regulate them, they're going to have a crisis for the same reason banks always do. And this time, it's going to infect the whole economy because Trump has legitimized it. Pension funds can hold it, ordinary individuals. If it happens soon, I don't think it'll be a big problem. But if it happens 3 years from now, I think it'll be a major international financial crisis.
But we are at our time, and thank you very much for
being
with us today.
Everyone. Thank you.